Hey everybody, it's Writer Punk. For this week's video, and in honor of Valentine's Day, I wanted to do something a little different than talk about romance tropes or tips by giving some tough love advice regarding critique. By the way, if you're new to my channel, I am a dark fantasy writer, artist, and hobbyist world builder. Anyway, I have split these 14 tips, which I am really more calling truths, into two categories: truths for writers and truths for critics. However, since a lot of the time writers will end up critiquing other writers' work, I would still give each a listen and see if they might apply to you in any way. Also, going with the theme of tough love, I'm going to be a bit more abrasive than I usually try to be regarding how I phrase things. So without further ado, onward. 7 Truths for Writers. Truth 1. Critique begets critique. I see this, unfortunately, a little bit too often, where writers will say, I'm not good at giving critique, I don't know how to critique, I don't like giving critique because reasons. Then moments later, I don't get a lot of good critique, no one wants to read my work, I put something up for critique but nobody even read it. Well, the number one way to get others to critique your work in earnest is to, drumroll please, read and critique their work too. I know that sounds like a lot of work, a lot of potentially boring, potentially annoying work, but doing this will achieve at least 3 things. 1, it'll help you build relationships with other writers whom you can then trust to read your work by having shown them that you're willing to be helpful as you are helped. 2, it helps you get better at critiquing others' work in a constructive, productive way. I see you, everyone who says you're bad at critique, do it anyway, you'll get better. And 3, it will make you better at writing. But how, I hear you ask? By helping you identify issues in others' writing that may appear in your own stories, improving your understanding of English or whatever language you write in, and by training your eye to spot mistakes that you may have otherwise missed because you are giving it a thorough read-through, right? I reply. Truth 2. Asking a non-writer to critique your work is not the same thing as getting criticism from another writer or an editor. First of all, readers and other non-writers read for the experience of the story. Writers and editors read for the enjoyment they get out of shredding your darling baby like spam mail. They read to get into the nitty-gritty of craft, technical ability, and all those storytelling mechanics that a non-writer is very unlikely to catch. We've all heard it before. Don't ask your friends or your family for criticism. While on some level I disagree with this, the basic idea makes sense. These people are much more likely to sugarcoat critique because they know you and don't want to hurt you, while the anonymous bowels of internet writing communities truly, earnestly don't care. They also likely won't be able to help you sort things that, unfortunately, are technical issues every writer from Nancy Nobody to George R.R. Martin falls prey to simply because they don't have the expertise. I apologize for my cat screeching in the background. He's fine. He doesn't like that he can't be in here when I'm recording. He has toys. There's another cat out there, Will, and my husband is doing something. You may not be as ready as you think you are for critique featuring write the damn book before starting draft 2. Another thing I have seen so many times. A usually new author gets stuck in a cycle of write the first chapter, post it for critique, edit it, post it for critique, decide it isn't good enough, rewrite it, post it for critique, ad infinitum, until they've spent 10 times as long writing the first chapter and have nothing else to show for it. Sometimes it's better to wait until you have the first draft, or at least more than one chapter, to start asking people for feedback, lest you fall victim to the law of editing cycles. Yes, first chapters are critical, and yes, a good first chapter can mean a good rest of the book, but if all you have is a first chapter, you need the rest of the book too. And even if you have a whole draft ready for critique, you might not be ready for critique. Maybe there are other things you can do to polish it up more before sending it out to get slashed to bits with a red pen. Maybe you aren't ready to hear anything negative. Maybe you aren't ready to apply the criticism you got in a way that's going to help you. Every writer goes through periods like this, so it's okay if this is the case for you. It will pass, and eventually you will have to get some form of feedback on your manuscript, so isn't it better to make sure that it's really truly ready before blasting off full steam ahead? Truth 4. Criticism needs a minute before it can help you. Give the feedback you've received a while to mull around in your mind before going in and ripping apart the draft, especially if you had a rough critique and you feel like scrapping the whole thing because you really shouldn't. Just give it a minute, wait, create some distance from your draft. It will allow you to see things more objectively and with perspective. You can't do that if your nose is firmly planted in the binding of what you just wrote. It also makes it easier to spot mistakes like doubling up words and wonky grammar. Take a few days, weeks, or even a few months if you feel you need it to gain that perspective and let any negative feelings about the feedback you got settle. That way you'll have an easier time of giving your draft the attention and care it deserves, and you're less likely to do rash things like delete entire chapters or the entire manuscript. That's not going to help anything. Truth 5. Even if you think it's perfect, others won't. By virtue of not being you, others will be able to see mistakes in your work that you cannot since you wrote it. Likewise, you will always have hang-ups that others didn't see or care about because you wrote it. Nobody, and I mean nobody, not even pro writers, can produce a perfect draft ever, much less on a first try. There's always going to be a problem, there's always going to be a mistake, or a typo, or something that could have been done better, or differently. But you really shouldn't be aiming for that sort of perfection anyway, as that way lies madness. Also, please, don't attack critics for giving you feedback you didn't like, even if it hurts or you felt it was mean-spirited. That's the fast track to losing a lot of people's goodwill very quickly, and as I said before, you will need feedback at some point, and you won't want to find yourself on everybody's blacklist. Truth 6. Criticism needn't be harsh to be valuable. Especially in certain forums, I have experienced some sort of weird draw to super harsh or critical forms of critique. Just because someone says something harsh doesn't mean it's true or even productive. Criticism that's diplomatic and polite can be just as useful as brutal honesty, and, at least to my observation, is actually more likely to help the author in the long run. So, don't discount critique just because it doesn't seem hardcore enough. Nitpicking and pedantics can only get you so far before it starts to become actively detrimental to your progress. I also feel it's fair to mention here that you shouldn't only accept nice critiques, or critiques that phrased things how you like them, or that think that you just wrote the best book on the whole damn planet. Swinging too far in the other direction can also be very detrimental to you and your story. Overall, you want to shoot for feedback that is assertive, constructive, and productive when you are assessing the critiques that you got received. I'm a writer, not a speaker. Truth 7. Ask not if you like the criticism, but whether it's objectively helpful. Just because you don't like a piece of feedback doesn't mean that it isn't true or potentially helpful. When you start applying critique to your next draft, don't ask yourself if you like the feedback the critic gave, but if it will help the story in some way, even if at first their suggestions seem silly or ill-suited to what you're writing. I myself have brushed off criticism that I wasn't keen on at first, but came to realize was actually a really good point while redrafting. This isn't to say that all criticism is 100% right and pure and can never be challenged because it's always right and you're always wrong and all of that. That's not true. Quite the opposite. It is indeed possible to have received a objectively bad piece of feedback, but sometimes we let our egos get in our own way. We're all only human though, so don't get too hung up on whether or not you should have said, they trudged ahead or they slogged ahead. And I will leave this Truths for Writers section with a bonus tip because I didn't have enough else to say about this to make a whole entire point out of it. It is okay to want praise, but save yourself and everyone else the trouble and just say so to begin with. Your feelings won't get hurt. They won't feel confused because they don't understand why your feelings are hurt, and it will be much more likely to achieve the outcome that you want and just become a more positive interaction all around. 7 Truths for Critics. Truth 1. Honesty and cruelty are not the same thing. How you say things matters. If you didn't like someone's work, it's pretty much never necessary to say, this sucked, or you're a bad writer. If you think no one would ever do that, you would be wrong. If someone came to you and said, I thought your story was awful, how would you feel? Probably not very good. Is it honest? Yeah. Is it productive? No. What if instead the same person said, your story wasn't for me, but good luck? Is that still honest even if you really did think it sucked? Yeah, and it's also a lot more productive. You really don't need to be cruel to get your point across. I would argue that the more diplomatically you are able to make your point, the more helpful your criticism will probably turn out to be. Being short, harsh, and snide with your comments can really quickly turn an author against whatever you have to say, which is really more of a detriment to them than if you had just said nothing at all. And presumably you are giving critique in the first place because you want to help them. It will more than likely make them defensive and prone to wave off your feedback wholesale if you're rude. I see this less often, but I have indeed seen it, which is when people critique the writer and not the writing. Attacking the author and not the story is not going to make anyone a better writer, and it definitely won't make you a better critic. Not to mention that critique should be composed of, at minimum, two things: the good and the bad. Any feedback you give should always mention at least one strength of the work, no matter how overshadowed by weakness, because you, as the critic, are supposed to help the author get better by pointing out flaws. If they don't know what to aim for, how can they ever hope to make the shot? Truth 2. Critique is to help the author tell their story. This one especially applies to critics who are also writers and are critiquing another writer's work. You aren't giving feedback to tell the author what you would do if you were writing the story, but to help them tell their story. Very frequently I see comments along the lines of, "I would do XYZ," or "If I were you, I'd," and I'm here to tell you that quite frankly it doesn't matter what you would do because it isn't your story. The purpose of critique is to help the author get their story into the best possible shape it can be. Their story. Ideally, when you're helping an author with their manuscript, you want to be able to give them critique based on their style and how they would do it if somehow they have gone off the trail of where their story should be going, and guide them back using their own rules and logic that they have come up with for the story. Truth 3. Manuscript critique is essentially an in-depth book review. Giving feedback does not mean just pointing out spelling and grammar mistakes and calling it a day. That's all the easy stuff. That's super easy, doesn't require a whole lot of critical thinking or remembering things or any of that, but it's also probably the absolute least helpful thing that you can do unless they are at the stage where they're about to publish the book. When you give feedback on a story, you are at minimum assessing two things: the experience of the story and the quality of execution. If you come out of a manuscript critique without having mentioned anything about the plot, characters, the setting, what you felt throughout the story, how it went, if you think it was executed well, and just dumped a bucket full of line edits on the author's lap, something has gone wrong. Most of the time, copy edits are just going to get tossed out anyway, since the precise wording of things is going to change so many times through drafting that any attention to those tiny details is just a waste of energy. You should basically be giving the author a book report or book review that lists what they pulled off, what they didn't, what gripped you, and what you were bored by. Leave the copy edits for the very last thing. Truth 4. Your personal story preferences don't matter. When it comes to giving feedback on someone's manuscript, which you presumably volunteered to do, your personal story preferences do not matter, and you should consider declining to critique if you know your preferences are going to bleed into your criticism. I have critiqued everything from retellings to fantasy erotica to space operas, and while many of these things were definitely not something I'd pick up on my own, I did not do it for my experience as a reader, but to help other authors tell their stories. Did I particularly enjoy reading in exquisite detail about Medusa getting by a minotaur? No, not really, but the story was important to the author, so I sucked it up and did what I could to help. Like I said earlier, how you would do it doesn't matter, nor does what you want to read. Unless you're some new breed of masochist, nobody critiques works they wouldn't read because they want to, but to help other people. Tip 5. I like to say that stories are not ponds, do not skim them. If you just aren't interested in someone's story, that's fine. Please just let the author know and step back in a courteous manner. Don't half-ass it by skimming through and trying to give feedback based on what you think you read. I have seen this happen to close writer friends of mine, and it's definitely happened to me more times than I can count on one hand. Believe me, most writers will be able to tell that you just skimmed, and it seriously affects the quality and usefulness of the feedback you give. It's imperative that if you're offering feedback, you take your time and don't cut corners. It's better to be a slow reader than an inattentive one. Speaking of, tip 6, take your time and meet your deadlines. Take the time to be thorough and ensure your criticism will be useful to the author. If they have a deadline you can't meet, or you decide you have better things to do, decline to begin with, or let them know you need to drop out. As soon as you know, you will not be able to help. Not after you get a snack, not in a few days, not after they send out the 3rd deadline reminder email. ASAP. Tip 7. If you're not invited to the party, please don't come. That basically what I'm saying is if someone doesn't ask for your help, please don't give it. This applies more in a group setting like an online forum or a chat room where lots of people are talking and posting at once. Some people just want to share or are looking for feedback that only someone who has previously read their work will be able to give them. It can be kind of surprising to receive critique from someone who you were not expecting to give feedback, especially if they are unfamiliar with you or your work, and perhaps you've posted like an out-of-context chapter from the middle of what you're writing, and they critique it like this is the opener to your story. It can be very frustrating, and it leads to more miscommunication than is really necessary. Since I did a bonus tip for the writing side of things, I decided to do one for this one, which is, please, by all means, take a lighter tone when you're giving someone feedback, especially if you have more negative things to say than positive. But, for the love of all things holy, please do not overdo the jokes, especially if you aren't close with the writer whose work you're critiquing. If a joke lands badly, it can insult the author or give you an awful case of foot and mouth. A good rule of thumb, if you aren't already familiar with the author, is that if you wouldn't tell the same joke about your coworker, it's probably not a good joke to make. So, these have been my weird amalgamation of truths and tips about critique for Valentine's Day 2020. If you particularly liked a certain point or particularly did not like a certain point, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you all for watching. As always, I appreciate all likes, subscriptions, and comments.